50 subscribers session about when manual tests smell, hidden problems and patterns. It's an award-winning presentation, has been presented and in Belgium at SAE. Wim de Koutere, our presenter, and Wim is a true CTG veteran. He has been part of our Academy of Wizardry and Test Magic for more than 10 years, and he has been secretly known as our Severus Snape, because really generations of test youngsters were afraid for his test design technique courses. They were aimed at finding the right potion to find the real difficult bugs. He was a true magical teacher in that, and he still is, ladies and gentlemen. Apart from serving in our Learning and Development Academy, he is also a board member on IREP and BNTQB, the Belgian chapter of ISTQB. So, a true hero for a true interesting session tonight. I still have one thing to ask to you all. If you have questions, don't hesitate. Put them in the chat, and we will make sure that they get to the presenter in due at the end of the presentation. Enjoy your presentation by de Koutere.
Thank you, Peter. I have to skip some slides first. Is on smells. I would like to start with is things that I'm not going to talk about. Or like to talk about scope, to talk about the things that are out of scope. First thing I'm not going to talk about is about test automation. There exist test smells for automated test cases, but they are not in scope for my story. I'm also not going to elaborate on test design techniques. Peter already mentioned that this, but I'm not going to elaborate in full depth on test design techniques. I'm also not going to talk about test management or test tools. They're not of interest for my story. They're completely, well, my story is can go completely without them. I'm also not going to give any definitions, except for one. The definition test case. What is a test case? When I'm talking about test cases in my presentation, I'm talking about the combination of an input, your starting situation, the actions you perform on those inputs, and the expected results. What are the outputs that come from your system? What data will be in? And that combination of those three steps, every test case should have a goal, an objective. If you cannot state why you want to execute the test case, if there's no actual goal, well, maybe you should wonder, execute the test case. These are derived from requirements, usually with the aid of test design techniques, and most test cases have some preconditions or some other test cases that were executed right before your test case. Those other tests might generate the data that you need, or they might set the situation that you need to start your test case. So that's the definition of a test case. Now, over the years, I see as real global tests that you read and that somebody is expecting you to execute. Now, what makes a bad test case? A test case for me is bad when you have to do duplicate work, when you have to do things over and over again, which don't make or don't have any added value. Doing redundant work, having to do things that actually do not help in finding defects, do not tell you, not learn you anything, well, that makes a test. Test cases that are unclear or ambiguous, those are horrible. Well, if you have no idea on what you have to test, or if it's not clear what you're actually supposed to be doing, well, how can you then be sure that the results you get are good results? Test cases that you can only execute once are also bad. If you break the database, if you corrupt test environment, case. And the one thing that I think is one of the most horrible things, one of the worst things you can do with their test cases is having test cases with a low maintainability. We all know that our requirements will change. That's why people love to go agile, love to work in an agile fashion, to embrace that change. But if you create test cases which have a low maintainability, then for every change there is to your requirements, you have to go through a lot of test cases making changes to them, which is a huge waste of time. A last cause for bad test cases, or a last reason for having bad test cases, is that your test cases smell. Now, what does it mean that cases smell? Cases, well, a smelling test case is a test case that appears at first sight to be a good test case. It gets results, it finds defects, it helps in getting coverage of your requirements. More depth and investigate more deeper, you might discover that actually it stinks and that it hides a deeper problem and that maybe even your entire setup is rotten. And that's something we want to avoid. Now, what causes these test smells? One of the first reasons for test smells is incompetence. The people that wrote the test cases are just not made for the job of a tester. They don't know what they're doing, they just write things down. Another reason for test smells is negligence. You don't care about writing good test cases. People pay you for writing test cases, well, that's what they do. They write test cases. They don't care if they're good or not, they just produce test cases. Another reason of test smells is inexperience. If you're new in the job and you didn't get a proper training or coaching on how to write good test cases, well, then you might write test cases that smell. Luckily, this presentation can help you overcome that inexperience, so that's already one help for you. Time pressure is of tests. If you put people under pressure, you can be sure that the work they deliver is of less quality. So don't put any pressure on people, give them the time to do their job. Another major cause of problems, not only for test cases, but for anything you do in life, making assumptions, thinking or assuming that whatever happens, that is correct, that it is a good thing, go for it. Be sure of what you do, what you have to do. Don't assume, never assume, and be sure of what you should do. What else can cause test smells? Well, that is instability. Instability of your requirements. Requirements that change constantly also require constant changes to your test cases, which might lead to smelling test cases. But also instability in your team. If you change the people that are working on your test cases, well, you can be sure that you will have test cases that smell and that are actually bad. A last major cause of test smells is using anti-patterns. Now, what are anti-patterns? Anti-patterns, according to the definition, are a common response to a recurring problem. There is something you want to solve, and you always go back to the same way of fixing it. And it appears to be an appropriate way of fixing it because you see a lot of people doing it. But usually it is ineffective. And it might even be counterproductive, that you even make bigger problems. And the work of patterns is that solve the problem, open track record, so that there is evidence that other way actually has good results. An example of a common anti-pattern is the use of an application called Waze. Whenever people are stuck in traffic, they turn on their cell phone, their smartphone, they open Waze, and they start looking for another road to get to their destination. But if everybody starts using Waze, we don't only get traffic jams on the highways, but also on the secondary roads. And what makes it even worse is that a lot more traffic in town centers, in places where you're not familiar with, which has an increase of accidents because you're not paying attention to the road, you're looking at Waze and seeing what small road do I have to take now, and accidents happen quickly then. Proposing the anti-patterns that I have discovered over the of anti-patterns. What I would like to add to those anti-patterns are also ways to come over them, to show you what is the better approach than following the anti-pattern. Now, the first anti-pattern, have we met before? What we see here is a test case in which we have to log in as a broker. And in another test case, we're actually testing the functionality of logging in as a broker. So the smell that we detect here is that we are covering something or testing something that is already tested someplace else. Explicitly, implicitly, but it's already covered somewhere else. Might even be worse that we have duplicate test cases that we're not aware of. Usually that happens if different testers are creating test cases and they're not aware of what the other tester is doing. Luckily, there are solutions for this. What are solutions for this problem? Well, establish a good link to your requirements, that you can measure the coverage and see if some requirement is already covered, that you don't create duplicate test cases. It also is a good idea to plan ahead who will write which test cases, who will elaborate on which part of the testing project. And what we have learned from Agile, well, we do collaborative user story writing. Well, why not do collaborative test case writing? Create your test cases together with all your test cases and improve the quality of your test cases. Second problem, second anti-pattern, Titleitis. What do we get here is a list of test cases and we only have titles. There is no expected result. And this is typically a business problem. If you ask people from the business to do some testing, they make up a list somewhere in Excel or in a Word file of all things that they want to test. But what they forget to mention is what the actual result is of the actions that they should do. They know the actual result because it's their job, it's their day-to-day job. They know exactly what they expect when they do a certain action. But if you have to execute those tests, you have no idea whether it's a pass or a fail. You can only do the actions, but you cannot assess whether you've met the expected results. Solution to this is obviously simple. Add expected results to any test case. And also make sure that you have a good link to your requirements, because your requirements are normally an indication of what the expected result should be. Test cases for dummies. This is something that a lot of junior testers suffer from. Somebody once told them in a track test cases that can be executed by your grandmother. But usually the teacher forgets that your grandmother doesn't even know how to turn on a computer or how a mouse works. So you're putting in a lot of details in your test case, things that are that obvious that any person who knows how to work with a computer can skip those steps, but you write them over and over again in every test case that you create. So the smell is that you have a full navigation path in every test case you create. You explain everything over and over again in every case you do. And you get a lot of repetition. The problem with this is that you have all these steps written in your test case, that when you're executing your test case, you always have to go through those same steps over and over and over again. How can we solve this? Well, we can work with preconditions. Instead of explaining how to get to a certain page, just explain in a precondition that you expect that the tester already is on that certain page. And if you still have to test the navigation to that page, well, maybe create separate test cases for your navigation script, test cases that check the layout of a page, and then the test cases that check the functionality. And for those functionality test cases, you can use the preconditions that the navigation has already been done. Another solution for this problem is making use of call cases. Modern test management tools allow you to create template cases to describe a certain number of steps that you can reuse over and over again in other test cases. So you only need to define them once, and then you can call them while executing your test cases. Invalidation Heaven. This is something a lot of testers suffer from. What is the problem here? Well, testers like to test for the negative things. We don't want to see that the things, well, we do want to see that the things are working like they should work, but we also want to see that things don't go wrong when we do things that are not supposed to be happening. So when we have to enter when we have a certain text field where we have to enter some data, testers can go completely berserk and test all possible combinations of wrong input for that field. And if we have good input validation, well, actually all of those invalid inputs are not allowed. But creating separate test cases for them, well, it makes us feel good because we have made a lot of test cases and we can say that a lot of test cases pass, but the actual added value is very little. So what should we do to avoid this problem? Well, try to combine all of these invalid inputs into one case and feed that case with parameters. Make a list, put it in a table, and feed it automatically to the test case, all those invalid test cases, so that you have one test that checks for invalid input, whether it's accepted or not. And maybe it's even better to use a checklist. Have a separate document that contains all those possible inputs and use that to test your application instead of creating a lot of test cases with little added value. Here comes the hot stepper. A song from Inika Mozo, somewhere out of the 90s. What is the problem with the hot stepper? Well, the hot stepper likes a lot of steps. Every possible thing in the system is placed in a different step. So you get a million steps for one test case. What is the solution? Obviously, if there's no specific effect, if there's no specific result happening for your actions, well, combine them together into one larger step that does all those little things separately. So you don't have to create a separate step entering the first name and a separate step for entering the last name. Just put it all together, enter valid data, and that's also okay. The other way around, steps clump or bulk steps is when we do too much. If we do too many actions in one step. And if you have to read through all of this, it's not really clear what are we supposed to be doing now. So at first sight, you don't really see what the goal of the test is. You need to dive into and get all the details by reading the entire test case, which takes up some time to understand what actually the goal is. So what should we do? Well, use preconditions. Steps that are not really needed, put them in the preconditions. Split your navigation, your layout, and your functionality. Make use of call cases. And try to avoid putting too many steps, too many actions into one step of your test case. You may all know the song Call on Me from Eric Prydz. If you have some spare time, look up the video on YouTube. I don't have the time to show it to you. But the problem with the anti-pattern Call on Me is that you make extensive usage of functions. You're making extensive use of other cases that you're going to call. You're making extensive use of parameters that feed data to your test cases. And your test cases start to look very technical. And for people with a more business background, do not have a technical background, they're afraid of these kind of test cases because they don't see what is actually what you're doing here. Login successful, complete form with invalid birth date, when adding invalid birth date. What is happening here? So this is typically a problem for more technical oriented testers, testers with a development background. Somebody once told them that maintainability is important. Well, maintainability is important, but already preparing yourself for the possibility of reusing certain steps, if it's not needed, don't create the call case for it. I've seen tests where you had testers creating for every line in their test case a separate call case, even though that line was only needed in one test case throughout the entire project. Don't go that far. So only create those call cases, those template cases, if they are being shared by other test cases. And what might also help is that you create a blueprint up front. Now, what do I want to say with this? What you can do is you can draw a map of your application, of your functionality. You can use the control flows of your application. And then you can split up what in what cases you are going to test these elements, that you plan ahead, how are we going to break up the application or the system? And that can help you in avoiding these kind of things, because then you can see that certain elements are only needed once. And then you can also see which element are needed more, and then you can create those template cases for that are being then called in the test cases that need them. The God case. What is the God case? Well, the God case is a problem that goes hand in hand with automation. People love to see a full end-to-end test that tests everything from beginning to end. And you get a lot of steps, a lot of actions to do. You have to log in with different profiles to continue the flow. What is the problem with this? Well, it will probably fail every time again, because there are just too many steps to execute, and usually it breaks at one of the steps, and then your complete test case fails and you never can tell that the test has passed. And preferably this is also automated, because then we can do a new build and run this God case, and then we can see whether it passes or not. But since it always fails, we always get a broken build according to this test. So how do we solve this? Well, split up your God case. Make smaller steps, make sure that every test case only has one objective, and put those test cases in sequence. So if there's a part broken, you know where in the flow there is something broken, instead of just knowing that the entire chain is somewhere broken. A bottom level test case. When you have a course on test design techniques, you learn that there are two types of test cases. You have high-level test cases and low-level test cases. High-level test cases describe your test cases on a high level. The data you need is described on a high level. It's more abstract of nature. Or for low-level test cases, you have more concrete data. It becomes more physical. Well, a bottom-level test case is a test case in which you hard-code every data element you're going to use. Obviously, we know that hard coding of data in anything we do is not the best thing to do, because our data might become corrupted or even be removed from the system, or somebody else is using it and it's no longer in the correct status. So we suffer from very low repeatability of our tests. How can we overcome this problem? Well, use high-level descriptions in your test cases where appropriate. Just give a description of what data do you need, instead of giving the actual data that is needed for the execution. For example, you can add an SQL query in your test case with a link to the database, so that you can fetch the data that you need at the moment you're executing it, so that you always get fresh data that fulfills the need for your test case. Another thing you can do is mention the data that you used in your execution log, so that you still have a trace of with which data that you tested, which might be important for reproducibility if you have encountered a defect or so. Another thing you can do is use parameters. And so you don't have to hard code the data in your test case, but you can feed the data table by changing the logs, the entries in the database. Click, push, press. Now this is one of my favorites. As Peter already mentioned, when IREP is about requirements engineering, and there it is important to be consistent in the words you use. And for me, you should do the same thing when you create your test cases. Is clicking the button the same as pushing the button or pressing the button? And is the switch the same as a button? And the summary, is that the same as an overview or the list? And consumers, is that the same as customers and clients? And that things are shown, does that also mean that it is displayed? It makes things confusing because you're switching terminology over each case. So what is important? Try to use a glossary with standard terms, but also with standard expressions, standard template phrases you can use for your test cases, so that you can just easily pick those standard phrases, those standard expressions from the glossary and paste them in your test case, so that you're always clicking the button, and then you just have to label the button. Big ball of mud. What's the problem with a big ball of mud? Well, you get accidental complexity. You start writing your test cases. Later on, you have to add some more. And here we see that we start with doing a withdrawal, then a transfer. We're going to print our statements. Then we do some more withdrawals, more transfers. We suddenly have to fill the ATM machine, and then we're printing some more statements. Things have become complex, and not because we planned, so it just happens. It has historically grown in this way. Why? Because there's no clear structure. We had different testers that had to work on it. Suddenly requirements changed. We moved test cases from one place to another, or we changed the title, we added things, and it becomes a big ball of mud. And it's not clear what we're actually looking at. How do we solve this? Well, as already mentioned, create a blueprint up front. Split up your application, split up your system, so that you know what you're going to test, who is going to test it. Make use of a glossary, standard expressions and terms. This also helps in avoiding this big ball of mud. And make sure that you have a good link to your requirements to keep the overview of your test cases. Over-testing. Again, a big risk, and that happens a lot with testers that really love their job. They see a requirement and they can come up with a lot of things they can also do to test. But you're actually testing for more than is needed, and you might even be testing things that are not required and asked for. And if you then start creating defects for the problems you've encountered, they will all be rejected because it is not a defect, it is not important. So a solution, keep a good link to your requirements. And if you don't have a link between your test case and a certain requirement, then maybe you're testing something that is not needed, and then it's better to remove the test case. The magic test. Peter already referred to me as Severus Snape. I am too a Harry Potter fan, but having magic tests is not the best approach when going for your test procedures. What is the problem here? Well, we have to do a number of steps, but it's not really clear how do we get from step 1 to step 2 and then to step 3. We're missing a couple of steps that we have to do. We have to do some magic to go from A to C because there's no reference to B. And it's actually more complicated than needed. And it might even give the tester too much liberty to execute the test cases, which might result in missing defects. A solution for this, again, create a blueprint upfront so that you know which part of the flows that you're testing and that you are forgetting about, and that you can also describe them in all your test cases. The Oracle. What is the problem with the Oracle? Well, very simple. It is the or. Whenever I see the word or in a test case, my hair already goes up. There's no reason for putting an or in a test case. If you want to test different things and have different options, well, then you have to create more test cases. Having different options for actions to execute, to read, or have different options for the expected results, which is even worse, well, just split it up. Split up your test cases, make sure that one test case has one test objective. Another thing you can do, split the navigation, the layout, and the functionality. If there are different ways of going to a certain step, well, those are all navigation steps. Test them all separately. One more step. Again, a problem I see a lot, and what is the problem here, is that you have to do actions in your expected result. And that should not, actions should be in your actions, and your expected result should just be facts. You're going to verify that are exactly as what you're expecting. But how you have to do this, that should be in the action. So if you have to go check in your log files, you should explain in the action where to find those log files, not in your expected results. Again, how do we do this? How do we solve this? Split your navigation, your layout, and your functionality. Make sure expected results are verifiable facts, that you don't have any actions in your expected result. And maybe you can make use of those call cases again to explain how to go to the location where you can verify or check whatever you have to make sure that it is correct. Oops, I did it again. This occurs when you're under time pressure. You're copy pasting test cases, you're making modifications, but suddenly a colleague asks you something and the modifications you had to do were not complete and you missed changing things. And suddenly you're crumpler. Spelling mistakes, incomplete words or sentences, bad copy paste, all smells that you should avoid. What's the solution here? Stay focused, take regular breaks, make sure you not get interrupted constantly when you're writing your test cases so that you can keep your focus. And make use of call cases so that you don't have to repeat things, don't have to copy paste things, but that you can reuse things. That's the list of anti-patterns that I wanted to share with you. Of course, there exists a lot more, but we cannot go on for days. But lessons that we can have learned from this is that there are things that we can do to avoid these anti-patterns. And what are the things that we can do to avoid these patterns? Design patterns. And I've listed them here on 2 slides. And the first elements that need establishing a good link to your requirements, adding expected result, use preconditions, use parameters, use call cases, limited dependencies, one test case, one objective, use checklist when possible. Well, these are the things you learn in a course on testing. But the other ones, creating a blueprint up front, plan who writes which test cases, making use of a glossary, use high-level definitions, split up your tests or sequence small blocks. You have to find the balance there. Splitting your navigation, your layout and your functionality, making sure that expected results that you can actually verify and that they're just facts and no actions, and that you stay focused and take regular breaks. Those are all design patterns that are not mentioned in test courses. Those are design patterns that I'm offering to you. And a lot that was mentioned in the previous slides, but that is also important to do, is that you have to review and refactor. Well, what does that mean? Reviewing means that you go over your test cases, that you use a checklist with the test smells that are important for you, that you suffer from at your project. Maybe you can even have a traceability matrix with the test smells and the different design patterns to overcome them. Use the glossary, have the glossary next to you so that you can look up the terms that are used in the test cases to make sure that they're defined in the glossary and that the right terms are used. And ask yourself the question after a first read of a test case, do you understand what has to be done? And if you have to reread the test case, it's not a good test case and it has to be refactored. Factoring means recreating your test cases. Simplify your test cases. Keep it simple, keep it short. The KISS principle. Clean up your test cases. Use the design patterns. Make sure that you apply them. Ask yourself the question, well, what is the effect if I would change this or remove this? And if the effect is positive or none, change it, remove it. And this reviewing and refactoring, this is something you should do regularly. Not just once, but constantly throughout the entire duration of your project. Why? To avoid test debt, to avoid that the mountain of problems in your test cases that you have to overcome becomes too high that you don't even know how to start with it. And if you do all these things, you get good test cases. And what makes up a good test case? Well, a good test case has a purpose. It has a goal, an objective. A good test case is readable and understandable. A good test case is feasible to be executed. Case is independent. It doesn't rely too much on other elements. A good test case is repeatable and reusable. You can reuse it in other projects. And what is very important for me, a good test case, so that if you're making your test case are minimalistic. That was my story. So if you would like to contact me, here are my contact details. And I think it's now time for the Q&A. So I'm looking at my colleagues here next to me.
Indeed, Wim, we have a couple of questions. Kevin Gijzenbergs wants to talk with Wim on when talking about the glossary, we should still make sure that the paradigm is understood by all. A customer can be conceived differently throughout the organization. How can you make sure this glossary is properly understood throughout the organization?
Well, setting up a glossary is not something you do together with stakeholders in your project. Just like requirement engineers have to set up the glossary in cooperation with their stakeholders, you have to do the same thing as a tester. So you have to ask people, well, this is my understanding, is that also your understanding? And come to a common understanding of the terms in the glossary together. You can set up meetings for this, brainstorming meetings or Teams meetings, Skype meetings, whatever nowadays with COVID. This is something you have to do together. It's not something you decide upon.
Okay, thank you, Wim. Another question, what about BDD development versus personas versus TDD?
That's a difficult question. Behavior-driven development, again, you're using certain templates. What can I say about this when you're describing behavior, when you're describing, well, TDD is actually development related. When you're describing behavior, you can also make use of a glossary. You can also set up your blueprint to determine which test is going to cover which aspect of the functionality, of the complete functionality offered by our system. So that's one thing you can do. Personas are usually something that you also define in a glossary. But for the rest, the question is not really clear what answer has been sought by me in this question.
I think you can take it up with the same wizard, because Kevin was also responsible for this one. So something to take offline, I guess, over a beer post-COVID to discuss further on.
Yeah.
Pascal did ask us if there was, from the checklist you were referring to at the start, if there is already a test tool that's ready to cope with all the useful hints, tips and tricks you were giving at the start of your presentation.
I'm wondering what is meant here with the definition of a test tool, but no, these design patterns that I offer, they're not already incorporated in test tools like maybe Jira. They do not take this into consideration yet. They do not help you in avoiding these mistakes. So the concept of test smells of these anti-patterns and design patterns is still rather young, and so it's not yet incorporated in test tools.
Okay, I'm looking for the moment to see if new questions are coming in, but I don't think so. Leading us to thanking you, Wim,